Hello and welcome to this game review covering a game played by Viktor Korchnoi. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He was born in the Soviet Union in Leningrad in 1931, passed away at 85 in 2016, and it looks like maybe he moved to Switzerland and became part of the Swiss Chess Federation. Now, if you're not familiar with Viktor Korchnoi, he was a very solid player. I believe he liked to grab a pawn, an extra pawn, and just hold on to it. And maybe he wasn't as tactical as Garry Kasparov or some other players, but he was a world championship contender. I believe he played against Anatoly Karpov for the world championship. I think in 78 and then again maybe in 81. If I have those numbers incorrect, feel free to leave a comment and correct me. But I think that's when he played because Karpov became the world chess champion by forfeit after Bobby Fischer didn't defend his title in 75. So then Karpov became the champion. And then I think 3 years later in 78, Karpov played Korchnoi, and then I think they played again in 81. So I'm going to pick a game that occurs, at the end of Korchnoi's career. He died in 2016, so I'm just going to play this final game that he played. And at the time, he's 85 and he still had a 24.99 rating versus 23.26 by Wolfgang Allman. So let's take a look at this game. If I run it through the analysis, it looks like now Korchnoi wins here with a 92% accuracy rating versus 87 by his opponent. But I will take a look at the computer moves or what the computer has to say about this game, and we can go over it and see what a great player Korchnoi was. It looks like he had 3 inaccuracies. His opponent had two mistakes and a miss. But let's take a look at this. I'll turn on the computer analysis, and then let me move my image here and center it up a little bit. Okay, so let's see what happens in this game. Korchnoi has the white pieces. This game was played in 2015, so 10 years ago. The final game in this database before Korchnoi passed away the following year. All right, he begins with c4, the English opening. Kind of a flexible opening. You can bring your knight in behind here. You wait to see what your opponent will do. His opponent responds with knight to f6, a flexible response. Often e5 will be played, and you have kind of a reverse Sicilian. So the knight jumps in behind the pawn. So there could be a big battle for this d5 square where the pawn is covering that, the knight is covering it. Let's see what happens next. All right. A fianchetto on the king side. So the game continues with e4 being played. So once again, this pawn helps fight for that important d5 square. Now it does leave a hole here on d4, and black may try to take advantage of that. So here we have d6, a flexible move. Maybe leaving the option of pushing the c pawn or the e pawn. Korchnoi grabs the center, and now it looks like we're almost transposing into the King's Indian defense, which usually has this set up by white and the following set up by black after the bishop goes here to g7. And sure enough, that's where it goes. And now we've transposed into the King's Indian defense normal variation. So often in this variation, white will just bring their knight up here to f3. They could bring this pawn to f3, keeping the knight out of the position or the bishop as well. So let's see what happens. Instead, Korchnoi develops his bishop, attacking the knight. So maybe thinking about trading, but more often you want to keep this bishop and try and maybe set up the queen bishop battery, try to trade off this dark squared bishop and create weaknesses around your opponent's king. So let's see what happens. All right, knight is developed, just backing up the other knight. Korchnoi continues with, oh wow, he brings all 4 pawns forward, really putting pressure on the center. And now the opponent goes ahead and castles to the king side. I would think that the next move might be to bring up the knight here, which, that sure enough is what was played. The game continues with a pawn striking back here, this flank pawn attacking the central d4 pawn. Now, here you have options. You could trade off here. That's one option. Push forward, gaining space in the center. Let's see what Korchnoi does. He does push forward, so he's more of a solid player. He probably wants to keep things closed, start maneuvering. He gains more space in the center, giving his pieces more room to maneuver, and at the same time cramping his position, his opponent's position. All right, queen develops, the first mistake of the game. This move basically pins the knight to the king. Korchnoi does have to watch out because now the knight is attacking this pawn and the pawn is no longer protected. So maybe he has to bring his bishop up here to help guard that pawn. And he does not do that. Instead, he develops the queen, so it breaks the pin. Now the knight can't capture, or it would just be captured, and then the queen would be under attack. So pressure is building over here on the queen side. We have an attack on this pawn. Will that be ignored? Because if it's captured, the bishop could capture, or do you push here? But one thing you have to watch out for, if you push this pawn, there could be a discovered attack if this knight moves, and then you could have the bishop piling up on that knight. So Korchnoi instead just grabs this pawn. And he was known for taking an extra pawn, trying to hold that pawn and go into the end game. So let's see how things continue. The queen trade is avoided because now Korchnoi is ahead by 1 pawn. He wants to avoid trading pieces and would probably like to trade pawns off the board. The game continues with the knight dropping back. This is an inaccuracy. Apparently it would have been better to develop the bishop to d3. So the game continues with rook and queen battery piling up here. How does Korchnoi respond? He just protects. But now if this knight were to move, well, I guess if this is attacked, the queen could just cover that. So it looks like everything is all right so far for Korchnoi. Now his opponent makes another mistake. h6 is preferred, putting the question to the bishop, but instead he's trying to trade pawns off in the center. So we have a capture, capture, and now the bishop centralizes. Korchnoi is ready to castle kingside. Bishop grabs the long diagonal here, aiming down towards the king side, and Korchnoi castles there. So the game continues with the opponent trying to trade off more pawns in the center. Korchnoi grabs space, attacking the knight. And now after the knight retreats, apparently this is a missed opportunity. Going forward, It looks like that may have been a better move. Now, why would that be better? I guess we could check it out. If he goes forward, the queen is under attack. They do not recommend capturing. Oh, you can't, because the bishop would protect that pawn. And you have to watch out for possible forks. So the best thing would be for the queen to just move out of the way here. All right. Well, in the game, we had a retreat. Korchnoi responds by moving his king into the corner. And now we have knight getting off the back rank, trying to reposition and get back in the game. You know, maybe after a trade here of pawns, the knight could jump forward. So the game continues with bishop attacking the rook. And now we have the rook counterattacking the bishop. And the bishop has grabbed this great outpost on d6, protected by the pawn here. And the game continues with Wolfgang Allmann, also I believe known as a solid player, not a tactical player. He tries to get rid of this great bishop on the outpost. So, Korchnoi obliges him, trading off. We have a knight recapture, and b3 is played. The best move according to the computer. We do have the bishop centralized here. A little bit of conflict building on that d5 square. Like I said, that can be a big source of conflict in this game where we have the knight, the pawn, everything piling up on that d5 square. So the game continues with the rook defending d5. Knight jumps forward attacking the queen. And now the queen just sidesteps over. The game continues with centralizing of the queen, maybe tempting this pawn to push forward. But that's not... oh, it is played. Okay. So now, queen is under attack. It drops back. And the knight steps forward with the threat of forking the pawn. Well, the pawn is protected by the queen, but it would put pressure on this bishop, which is blockading this passed pawn. So the game continues with knight jumping forward. The opponent counters with their own knight jumping forward, although queen to c7 is preferred by the computer. But the bishop is under attack now. Where should this bishop go? The bishop centralizes, attacking the queen, and after the queen steps away, we have a bishop trade. And Korchnoi grabs another pawn. So we see how he just maneuvers his pieces around, picking these pawns off, and let's see how he converts his two-pawn advantage into a win. At this point, the computer says he's completely winning. So the game continues with queen to b8. Knight drops back and into the center, guarding the other knight. There's also a possibility of jumping here or here. If the knight jumps here, we'll have a fork of king and rook. The other knight could get ready to jump back in there and take its place. So the king steps forward. We have an attack on the knight, retreat, and the pawns are moving on the queen side. So the game continues with a knight attack. And generally, you don't want to trade off material if you're behind in material. You don't want to trade off pieces. You want to trade off pawns. So that move just helps Korchnoi trade off more pieces, which is what you want to do if you're ahead in pawns like this, or ahead in material in general. So after recapture, we have a fork of both rooks here, and Korchnoi is just doing a great job of putting the pressure on Wolfgang Allmann and just keeping that pressure up. So now we'll probably have an exchange here of knight for the rook, yes, and queen blockading this passed pawn. And after the knight repositions, maybe heading to here. Let's see what happens. Korchnoi is just moving those pawns up the board. Very dangerous, especially this passed c pawn here. The game continues with knight grabbing the outpost, and the pawns keep moving up the board. The rook tries to add pressure to the unprotected pawn. The other pawn starts marching, and it's really looking bad for Korchnoi's opponent with these extra pawns. So we have a blockade by the queen. The rook lines up behind the passed pawn. So if that queen can be pushed out of the way, that pawn will just keep on moving up the board. Counter strike by Wolfgang Allman. There's not much he can do here, so he just pushes on the king side, giving his king a little bit of space. And now the other pawn is pushing up the board. So the game continues with the rook dropping back to help defend all these pawns. Now we have rook centralizing. Knight jumps onto the outpost, targeting the rook. So the rook steps out of the way of that. And now pawn is pressing forward. That's ignored. And the queen targeting another pawn here. So the game continues with defense by his opponent's queen. And we're kind of winding down to the end here. The game continues with the pawn capture. And so that is a good strategy. When you're ahead in material, a lot of times you can give back a little bit of material, and still remain ahead, but you relieve some of the attacking pressure. Here, Korchnoi just got rid of that knight on the great outpost there. And his opponent's just left behind here. Now there is pressure on this pawn, so that pawn is probably going to be captured as well. And now there's this threat of a back rank possibility. Or is it a threat? Because if you go here, rook could capture, queen could capture, but this queen could block, I guess. Although then the queen would be able to go up and start attacking pawns. So Korchnoi, he just avoids any complications by moving his king over towards the center, preventing any kind of back rank threats. And then there's also this big threat of the passed pawn pushing forward. The queen can't even move over here to stop it, or else the rook will be captured. And so this is why the opponent resigns. I mean, what can he do here? If he drops the rook back to where it's protected by the pawns, well then that pawn can start pushing up the board, and there's not a good way to stop that from promoting. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Feel free to leave any comments. I'll try to do more reviews of Viktor Korchnoi in the future. I had a request for some reviews on that particular chess master. A great solid player. If you don't like tactics as much, you might want to check out more of Viktor Korchnoi's games for maybe more solid strategic chess. So stay tuned in the future for more Viktor Korchnoi games. Also, like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.